Jewish history can be divided into 8 periods, and we're going to survey all 8 of them in this lecture. The first period is the period of Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the era of Judges, so approximately 1300 to 1029 BCE. Most of what is known about this period comes from 3 books of the Bible: Exodus, which we mentioned in the last lecture, the book of Joshua, and the book of Judges. In this period, the Hebrew people essentially were led by prophets, by inspired men and sometimes women who were called prophets or judges. But the book of 1 Samuel says that the Hebrews demanded that they should have a king like all the other countries, and God granted their request. This leads into the second period in Jewish history called the Period of Kingdoms, which lasted from about 1030 to 585 BCE. The first king they had was named Saul, who reigned from roughly 1030 to 1010 BCE. Saul is a tragic character, a somewhat good and a somewhat bad person. He ends up dying in battle. He's succeeded by David, another fascinating character. David is considered a prophet in Judaism, and also the author of many of the Psalms. And the main symbol of Judaism is called the Star of David. David was a great military leader, and in the Bible God tells him that he won't be allowed to build God's temple in Jerusalem because he has too much blood on his hands. The first temple in Jerusalem is built by David's son Solomon, who reigned from about 970 to 930 BCE. Here you can see an artist's rendering of the first temple, and it's probably fairly accurate because very detailed directions about the temple are given in the Bible. The period of kingdoms is described in the biblical books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And we should also mention the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which covers the beginning of the period, Samuel being the name of the prophet who reigned over the Hebrews before their first king. And these books don't go in a sequence. Actually, what happens is 1st and 2nd Chronicles redescribes and expands on some of the events that are recorded earlier in the books of Samuel and Kings. The books of Chronicles are a somewhat later retelling from a slightly different theological perspective of many of the same events. In the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon, the Hebrews were united into one kingdom, but this changed in the year 930 when Solomon died. At that point, their nation split into the northern kingdom, called Israel, and the southern kingdom, called Judah, and those kingdoms were to meet different fates. According to this part of the Bible, there was a constant struggle going on in the Hebrew people. Even though the one true God, Yahweh, had rescued them from Egypt, still many in Israel and in Judah followed the practices of the surrounding nations and worshipped various traditional deities, using various traditional idolatrous methods. From the 700s down to the 400s, there were various prophets trying to reform Judaism, trying to make the Hebrews be faithful to the God Yahweh and to leave behind these other practices. And the kings went back and forth on this. Some kings supported the worship of other deities, particularly if they had foreign wives who were interested in doing that. And other kings veered back towards exclusivity to one God. And it's unclear how monotheistic Judaism was during this time. Did they think, as it says in the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Isaiah, that Yahweh was the one true God? Or did they think that Yahweh was the God of Israel, whereas the other nations, the other groups of people on the earth, each have their own gods? The year 722 BC, and by the way, now we're very much into the realm of known recorded history and not prehistory. In that year, the northern kingdom of Israel, as opposed to the southern kingdom of Judah, was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and the sources say that they took 27,000 captives. Notice that the southern nation of Judah is still there, but the northern parts that were taken included 10 of the tribes composing the Hebrews. People later referred to these 10 tribes as the lost tribes of the Hebrews, or the lost tribes of Israel. What happened to them? Most historians would say they were taken as captives back to Assyria, and they must have, over several generations, intermarried with the people there, and they ceased to be a distinct people. They lost their religious or their racial identity. There have been also many speculations about where these tribes might have ended up. It's possible that some of them ended up in Bombay, India. Some have speculated, as in the Book of Mormon, that they ended up in America. That, although, is not taken seriously by historians because we know that the Native American tribes were not Semitic peoples. They're Asiatic genetically. Others have said that some went to Ethiopia. That's possible. There have been Jewish communities in Ethiopia. And others have speculated, believe it or not, that the lost tribes ended up in England. And as far as I know, that's not taken seriously by historians. There's a mix here of history and speculative conspiracy theories and just plain fiction. In the book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 37, God promises to bring them back to live in Israel. The southern nation of Judah held out for a while longer until it fell prey to another big expanding empire, this time not the Assyrians, but rather the Babylonians. In the early 500s BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II repeatedly invaded Jerusalem and took away captives to Babylon. There's material relating to this in the biblical book of Lamentations. These are sorrowful reflections of Jews living in Babylon in exile among a foreign people away from their homeland. In 587 and 586, Solomon's original temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. These two destructions, these two exiles, are interpreted by the prophets in the Bible as God's judgment for the Jews' unfaithfulness. And yet those same prophets say that God is merciful, and that after he's done punishing them, he will allow them to be a people again. This brings us to the third period, the period of exile and return. The Babylonian captivity is dated 585 to 538. That's when the residents of Judah, most of them, were living as second-class citizens in Babylon. But in the year 539, Babylon is conquered by Cyrus II of Persia. And in 538, Cyrus allows some Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple to Yahweh. This is covered in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Evidently, this emperor believed that their God, Yahweh, was a real God and perhaps an important one, and so as to get the favor of this God, he decides to be nice to his people. While some of the Jews stay in Babylon, some of them go home and rebuild Jerusalem. And they eventually rebuild their temple to Yahweh in Jerusalem. And under Persian rule, for around 200 years, they live in relative peace. In our next segment, the Jews exchange Persian overlords for Greek-speaking ones.